Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to start our day, it is my honor to invite Dr. Joseph Lo Bianco, Emeritus Professor of Language and Literacy Education, Melbourne Graduate School of Education, University of Melbourne, to give his keynote speech entitled Language Policy and Social Cohesion in Multiethnic Countries, the Case of Southeast Asia. I would also like to welcome another Dr. Joseph Lee Kuang, Vice Chancellor, Inti International University, as the moderator of the session. Dr. Lee, the floor is all yours. Welcome.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Dear ladies and gentlemen, fellow educationists and colleagues. It is indeed an honor for me to have this opportunity to moderate the keynote session this morning on language policy, social coherence, and the language problem in multi-ethnic countries, the case of Southeast Asia, by Professor Dr. Joseph Lo Bianco, Professor Emeritus Language and Literacy Education, University of Melbourne, Australia. While I am, just like many of you, are anxious to hear viewpoints of Professor Lo Bianco on this very interesting and important topic, but however, please allow me to briefly introduce the background and experiences of Professor Lo Bianco. Professor Lo Bianco wrote Australia's national policy on languages in 1987, the first multilingual national language policy in an English-speaking country, which is really an outstanding achievement, and was the chief executive of National Languages and Literacy Institute of Australia until 2002. He has also advised on language, culture, and literacy education and on the integration of indigenous and immigrant children into mainstream school, reconciliation and peace through education in many countries, including Canada, Ireland, Italy, Singapore, South Africa, Sri Lanka, Thailand, the United Kingdom, and Vietnam, and many others. From 2011 to 2017, he served as a research advisor for a European Commission project on language in urban community, integration and diversity for Europe, conducting a large scale of 4-year research in 12 European cities. Definitely, we know the impact and influence of Professor Lo Bianco is worldwide. In January 2014, he commenced in an academic advisory role with the National Research Center for Foreign Language Education in Beijing Foreign Study University, China, which has include providing advice to the State Language Commission of China and supporting academic research initiative. Definitely that for a researcher, this is an outstanding achievement. Professor Lo Bianco supervised PhD research projects and teach courses in language planning and support international research projects in several countries on language and cultural study, language planning, and multiculturalism, intercultural education. This is definitely actually going into the grassroots and affecting many of the students and teachers as well. His language policy advisory activity include language service for the Sydney Olympic Games, a report which was subsequently used to support the planning of language services at Athens and the London Games, assistance to the government of Ireland to produce a 20-year strategy to support the life of Irish, support on basic education, literacy and language policy in South Africa, Hawaii, Italy, Alberta, Pacific Island countries, and preparation of the National Language Education Plan for the government of Sri Lanka in 1999 under the financial support of World Bank, and commission support for language policy in Scotland and Northern Ireland, among many international collaboration activity. Definitely with this kind of achievement and coverage in the worldwide and different countries, definitely that we would love to hear the views of Professor Lo Bianco. And with those outstanding achievement and contribution, we are pleased that Professor Lo Bianco is here with us today. Let us all welcome Professor Lo Bianco for his sharing and insight on the topic, language policy, social coherence, and language problem in multi-ethnic countries, the case of South Asia. And we will have some time at the end of the presentation for question and answer. So ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Professor Lo Bianco to the keynote. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that generous invitation, Dr. Joseph. And it was lovely talking to you the other day. And I want to congratulate the organizers for this excellent effort. I really enjoyed Professor Kathleen Hughes' address yesterday, as I'm sure everybody did. And that kicked us off very well. It's really nice to be connected to so many Malaysian colleagues. I've had the great pleasure of visiting nearly every part of Malaysia and working with people there. So it's been a great pleasure. And I'll be talking a very little bit about Malaysia in today's presentation. I need to share the screen to be able to get my PowerPoint up as soon as I can find it. Is that clearly visible? Dr.
I couldn't see the full screen. Okay.
It's showing that it's
it's showing with a calendar and Outlook. Are you projecting the window correctly, or I'm not too sure? Yeah.
Mine is showing that it's sharing. Can the technical person check this, please?
Probably you need to close the panel on the right because it shows November, your calendar on your right, and it seems like is the Outlook. You are showing the Outlook.
It's showing Outlook.
Yeah, in the Zoom you may need to choose the different windows.
I'm sharing the wrong window.
Yeah,
okay.
I think different windows in when you select the Zoom sharing.
So is it this one?
Now here you are, correct? Okay. Yeah, if you can bring that to full screen and into presentation mode, then we are okay.
So
great, fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, this is great. This is great.
All right, very good. Thank you for your patience, everybody. As you can see, the topic is language policy, social cohesion, language problems in multi-ethnic countries, the case of Southeast Asia. I'm going to begin by citing this statement that was made to me by someone actually in Malaysia when we were talking about language policy. It was in Sabah, but this is found everywhere. This person said, oh, we don't talk about language problems, shouldn't use that word. And this is interesting because it reflects the way in which language policy theory and scholarship has developed. It actually doesn't talk about problems anymore. And I want to deal with this issue because I think it is actually a big problem not to talk about problems. As you see there, I say language policy studies as an academic field emerged when problems were not a problem. And that actually was a problem, as I'll explain as we go along. The original language policy work of the pioneers in the late 1940s and early 1950s often regarded multilingualism as a problem. Multilingualism is regularly named as a problem of post-colonial developing countries. It's named as a problem aggravating social conflict, holding back economic progress, or the educational achievement of children, especially children who don't speak the official or dominant language of the society they're in. And this was heavily criticized, leading really to the question that my comment that I cited before that my friend made, we don't talk about language problems, by pushing the idea of problems.
We lost your voice.
Oh.
Now you are back.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know what could have caused that. Okay, I'll press on. I hope, I don't know, how long did you lose the voice? Should I retrieve any of the material?
Just a few seconds, actually.
Oh, okay, all right. Yes, I've got a very good Wi-Fi connection here, so I'm puzzled about why that happened. So language policy began as an academic field in universities in North America mainly, but in some other settings in the world, as of course the practice of language policy making and language planning is extremely ancient and predates any university itself, and obviously arose, in my opinion, when communication began, for reasons I won't go into now. But as an academic study, we really can trace it to the late 40s, early 1950s. Over the years, this unexamined assumption that the kind of imagined monolingualism of the United States that was critiqued, and another assumption that the outsider expert would come in and solve the language problems of countries in Africa or Asia or Latin America, or even parts of Europe, frankly. When people talk about the global North and the global South, there are often global South settings in the global North, including in Europe. And I think we can really find exactly the same dynamics going on in those places as elsewhere. So this idea of the outside expert who comes in with technical abilities and solves problems of multilingualism was very much present in the early days, and for a long time, actually, in language policy theory. And the normalized stance of the US as the model advanced national state was also present. So for these reasons, language policy practice and theory was criticized, mostly from the 1980s onward. And it had many good effects. It forced the field to become less centered on the global North, less focused on some countries and not others, etc. It improved the conceptual and theoretical position of the area very, very much. But I think it went too far, because critiquing some problems and pushing them into ever increasing levels of abstraction actually alienates scholarly research away from the needs of policymakers and also practitioners in schools. This is going to be one of my arguments today. So this is public policy is a problem-based practice. The government of Malaysia, the government of Singapore, the government of Sri Lanka can you hear me now? I received a notice to say that I was muted.
No, we can hear you clearly.
Yes, I was muted by the, okay. Public policy and in any situation is a problem resolving practice. And so for academics to talk about their area of work as though it's never got anything to do with problems is in fact a way of alienating ourselves from conversations with policymakers and officials. And we should never do this, because we want the research that we do in collaboration with communities to count in practical ways. So I've developed an alternative language policy that tries to retrieve some of the focus on technical problem solving from the original period, and also respect the criticisms, the correct criticisms that were made of the field of language policy and practice. And I call this LP facilitated dialogue. And I'm going to talk about that. What we do basically in this process is work with participants to develop their own guided policy designs. And a large part of what we talk about are what problems are, what they mean, and how to deal with them. In other words, the naming of the problems and how they're represented comes from a democratic process of discussion with the most interested groups of people. I've implemented this in some 40 of about 45 dialogues I've done in Myanmar over the past 8 years, but also in Malaysia, in 8 dialogues in Sabah, Sarawak, and on Peninsula Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Thailand, many other places. And it began in work that I was doing on trilingual rights and peace building in Sri Lanka in 1997 to 1998, and previously in Australia. So that's the background context of the work, and I'm going to describe it and give it more context as we proceed now. Facilitated dialogue is a language policy method, so therefore, that tries to be both practical, that is responding to what officials need, and research-based. It aims to deal with language problems democratically from multiple perspectives. So it isn't just a group of elites deciding what problems minority populations have and imposing solutions on them. It's often accompanied by what I call queue sorting research, but I'm not going to have time to talk about that today. But if anyone's interested, please contact me and I'm happy to make information available to you about that. So in effect, it's a form of collective writing that we do. And by bringing all these perspectives together, we get community lenses, expert lenses, and public officials. The aim is to produce a situated and local representation of what communities want for the language arrangements of their communities. So it's very much a human rights-based approach. And this is radically different from the original way in which language problems were regarded. Now, the process can be time-consuming, and that's because it's doing something which I think is necessary, which is talking through in a deep way to share knowledge, to build knowledge together. But it has the benefit of authentically building on community experience and giving people the skills to do their own research, interpret, and determine their own needs. The main context and for a lot of this work is the question of social cohesion. Nearly all governments are worried about social cohesion these days. And if you think about the two words together, social and cohesion, you can see why many societies would be. Social and cohesion together mean basically that social groups are not in conflict with each other and are able to work together for common good. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, the Rich Countries Club, has done a lot of research on this in developing or global South societies, as well as in rich developed countries. And they've come up with some generalizations about what it looks like. I'm going to present some of their ideas, then I'm going to present some ideas from other sources about how to understand social cohesion. Now, I want to stress that many of you are educators. I'm an educator too. And social cohesion is actually something that's deeply relevant in education. Almost everything that the researchers in sociology and in economics point to is something that comes back to what schools end up doing and what we ask teachers to do and know. And because it's social, language is absolutely central, because the social relationship between human beings is, of course, utterly dependent on our communicative ability. So this means both questions of identity within groups and of communication across them. The OECD has identified 3 dimensions: inclusion, capital and mobility, I'll describe just very briefly what they mean, as being critical for societies to include in their sense of what social cohesion is. Now, I know very well, because I've visited it several times, Malaysia has a very developed, within, I believe it used to be anyway, in the Prime Minister's department, social inclusion and cohesion practice, which even includes kindergartens. Now, inclusion means effectively that most groups, not every individual within every group, but most groups do not feel themselves excluded. It doesn't always mean that they feel themselves included, that most individuals develop social capital, which means the knowledge and skills to progress economically in life, to represent your interests. And this deeply means language, of course, and literacy, and social mobility. Now here, immigrants and Indigenous people are positioned slightly differently, because immigrants, such as my parents who came to Australia, frequently displace their expectation of social mobility onto their children. Now, everyone does this to some extent. For immigrants, it's very sharp, because what they tend to do is imagine that they, as adults, will not have the mobility they would have had in their home country, and so they defer it completely onto their children. So this is how the OECD has seen it. In Canada and the OECD, and then I've got a refinement that came from a conversation I had with Dr. Vincent Pang at University Malaysia Sabah in Kota Kinabalu a few years ago. I just want to elaborate these ideas. So Dick Stanley reporting on Canada's official sense of what social cohesion is. It is defined as the willingness of members of society to cooperate with each other, that is, to not fight each other, in order to survive and prosper. Willingness to cooperate means freely to choose to form partnerships and have a reasonable chance of realizing goals, because others are willing to cooperate and share the fruits of their endeavors equitably. So you can see there's a mutual relationship there between all groups in a society working together. That was at least the understanding of the official Canadian definition a few years ago. I haven't checked to see if they've updated it, but I think it's a good statement of one way to think about social cohesion. The OECD, I've just discussed it now, talked about a cohesive society is involved in the well-being of its members. It fights exclusion and marginalization. It builds trust, etc., and it offers its members the opportunity for upward mobility. Now, when I spoke to Dr. Vincent Pang many years ago, he made the point that social cohesion includes resilience. It doesn't imply, or shouldn't imply, the absence of tension, because there is always likely to be tensions in society. Some people want to do some things and other people disagree with them, but the ability to resolve those things relatively amicably. Now, it's surprising to me, although I shouldn't be surprised in my many years of being involved in these things, how often policymakers and officials ignore the importance of language when it's so obvious and we can see it. And yet it is still surprising to me in my advanced years that very few of these definitions, even the Canadian one, which is after all an officially bilingual and multilingual society, ignore the question of language, as they often do. The United Nations tends to work with a sense of peacekeeping, which is an advanced form of social conflict resolution where social cohesion has fallen apart. And peace building is more like what is in the picture below, the UN soldiers, the blue berets, going in to keep the people fighting apart. So peace building, which is a concept we get from Johan Galtung, I'll talk about him in just a minute. And that photo is my photo of a facilitated dialogue that we did in Mon State, in the town of Molomyine, the capital of Mon State in Myanmar. And we are writing a local language policy, and the hands that are dueling there are doing what Vincent Pang was talking about, resolving a difference of opinion about the role of languages other than Burmese or Myanmar language and Mon language, the official language or the main language of the ethnic group of Mon state. There are at least 3 other languages in that state. So what we're doing there is collective writing. So it's important to keep these two concepts apart. And the person who did that was Johann Galtung, who's really kind of regarded as the grandfather or the father of peace theory. He introduced concepts like negative peace. Now, in this first picture, the UN soldiers going in is a kind of negative peace. If they stop people from fighting each other, then we have peace, but it's not actually ideal peace, because if they weren't there, that fighting might resume again. And that's quite different from positive peace, where people do more of what the Canadian or the OECD definition of social cohesion is talking about. And peace building is a way of producing positive peace. So these are important concepts that come through this work that started in the Norwegian researches that were begun by Johann Galtung many years ago. I'm just going to give you some instances now where language has been a source of significant social conflict and develop towards a description of language policy and social cohesion from this. Everyone knows, I think, these days that in February, on the 21st of February every year, we mark a worldwide International Mother Language Day. But not everyone is aware of the history of this. Today in Bangladesh, there's a Bangla Academy, which promotes literature and culture in Bengali, or Bangla, the official language of Bangladesh. It implements the national language policy and it does research. But the reason it exists and does this is because of a war for independence that actually was provoked by a language conflict, which resulted in the shooting of students on the 21st of February 1952, in which many were killed. And if you go to Dhaka, one of the sites to visit if you're a language person is the Shahid Minar, which is the memorial. There are several memorials to language martyrs or victims in the world. And one of my objectives as a tourist, if it was ever post-COVID possible, would be to visit all of them. And I've visited some already. And not all of them are inspiring, but this one is. After Indian intervention in 1971, Bangladesh achieved its political independence, recognized Bangla as the sovereign code of its people. And so what had been a language-based conflict that had started by those students you can see in that photograph, demanding that not that Urdu would be their official language, but that Bangla would be, was eventually achieved, but 20 years after them. In keeping with some of the points that were made yesterday by Professor Hugh, another very compelling example, which is often ignored. I've read many histories of the Soweto riots and of other ways in which the apartheid, the unequal development and race-based politics of South Africa before the dismantling of apartheid worked. And very few of them actually give much attention to language, when in fact, a large part of what happened that led to the dismantling of the system was the killing of students in Soweto in 1976 on the 16th of June, when high school students marched against what the Bantu Education Act, calling it gutter education. Now, yesterday we heard that actually the meanings of terms, including bilingual education, mother tongue, home language, heritage language, multilingualism, are different in different contexts. And here it's very important to keep those points in mind, because they were being offered bilingual education, but they were being offered bilingual education that excluded their mother tongue. They were being offered to learn subjects in Afrikaans and English, but they demanded to learn literacy and subjects in their mother tongue and preferred English over Afrikaans. And today, as many of you know, this dramatic picture, which represents the terrible events that occurred at that time, with many, many students killed, was one of the moral failings of the system that ultimately led to its dismantling because of these terrible events. Within Southeast Asia, in a study that was done for the Asia Foundation by Parks, Coletta, and Oppenheim, there are many conflicts that involve grievances of language that are not named as language issues. You can see here from this report, minority populations living in subnational conflict areas are often subjected to prolonged assaults on their identity that contribute to their perceptions of injustice, and that these are often driven by even language policies, citizenship criteria, etc., and public attitudes. 26 such conflicts in just a few years ago, and most of those are continuing, and several of them have worsened. And yet, despite this very strong presence of an association between the oppression of language differences, it's not multilingualism that causes conflicts, it's the oppression of language minorities' rights, because I'll talk about that a bit later. Despite this, sociologists and other people studying conflicts often misread what is going on. I've got here two political scientists, William Bostock and David Layton, both very distinguished scholars, reaching completely different conclusions about the Sri Lankan conflict after the adoption of the 1956 official language law. Bostock's conclusion is that ethno-linguistic diversity and language problems are pervasive sources of conflict, and that language grief is overlooked or downplayed. Whereas David Layton, looking at exactly the same conflict, says neither language differences nor grievances lead to violence, maybe political protest, not violence. Language and conflict, and therefore language and cohesion, suffer from very poor treatment in the work of non-language based academics. So scholars in sociolinguistics and applied linguistics, and these areas focus on language, of course, it's our business. But, you know, my first degree was in economics, and I studied another degree in sociology, and I found absolutely the most minimal acknowledgement of language in society, language in economy, in any of these areas, and I've kept up in some of them. And since I've become interested in peace building work and involved in it in the last 30 years, it's very clear that even peace building scholarship hardly ever looks at language. And this is very shocking to realize. As I've said, and some of you have heard me say, we tend to look through language and not see it. It's underneath our nose, it passes our attention. It's language oppression that leads to language grievances, and poor language policy that fails large numbers of children, pushes them out of school when they could achieve their potential by continuing on, especially by producing poor literacy outcomes in official and dominant languages, which children often need to compete in the labour market, and it alienates them from their ethnic communities by often teaching them that they are inferior or backward, and ignoring their rights to be proud of their family and their ancestral traditions. All of this leads to intergenerational poverty and unemployment, and the likelihood of radicalization. I'm going to tie this together in a little while. The Asia Pacific region, as you can see from this quote that I've taken from The Diplomat magazine, is the region of the world's most dynamic economies, the fastest growing societies, the locus of the economic energy of the whole world. But it is also the region, as Ugue Gubula talks about here, where 9 out of 10 children and adolescents in low-income countries in the Asia-Pacific and 3 out of 4 adolescents in low middle-income countries are enrolled in school but do not achieve basic literacy and numeracy. And she goes on to talk about that in more detail there. So we can see that the contribution to alienation that underachievement in schooling makes is likely to be substantial, especially if it's predictably groups of people from the same ethnic background that are not achieving. And that is the fault of education systems. It's not the fault of the community or families. Now, I've recently been working with the National Unity Government in Myanmar, which is the legitimate elected government that was supposed to take power and was dislodged on the 1st of February in the military coup, the very violent military coup that goes on, unfortunately, there. And it's interesting, the level of appreciation that exists now among progressive circles in Myanmar about the extreme importance and neglect that has been the case in relation to the rights of minority people by dominant groups. So in these subnational conflicts in Myanmar, and there are 6 there, we see the denial of language rights, which many groups have struggled for in Kayin State, in Mon State, in Kachin State, in Shan State, in Rakhine State, all across the country. Language grievances also in relation to Myanmar, in a University of Amsterdam research team, found exactly the same kind of thing among young people and women, and teachers, researchers found strong evidence for the idea that William Bostock was proposing before of language grief. In a study done by Brown and Ganguly, in a book by Brown and Ganguly 2013 that had case studies from 14 Asian countries called Fighting Words, the single most important factor in ethnic grievance and ongoing political mobilization was the denial of indigenous language rights in the traditional lands of minority populations. So you can see that this is probably a very widespread phenomenon. It's true in the United States just as much as it's true in Australia, just as much as it's true anywhere on earth. National states prefer and favor the languages of dominant groups. We have 7,000 languages in the world, but only 193 countries. The vast majority of countries favor only one language, some of them 2, some of them 3. The South African Constitution recognizes 11, but in the vast majority of situations, including in South Africa, they are in effect favoring one. Professor Sulay Premsrirat from Mahidol University has led a very distinguished and important project in the south of Thailand and received the UNESCO King Sejong Literacy Prize in 2016 for this great work. And you can see here that in her acknowledgement speech, she recognizes really what I've been talking about here, that failure to achieve Thai in schooling, in the Thai monolingual school system, has meant that many of the Patani Malay speakers who speak a variety of Malay called Patani Malay in the 3 southernmost provinces of Thailand, where there has been conflict for some years, do not go on to higher education, and yet in the small number of bilingual schools that have been set up, in which Dr. Kirk Person produced an important UNICEF analysis of the achievement of the children in these schools, far and away greater than any of their peers in the Thai-only program. So the Malay Thai, the Patani Malay Standard Thai or Central Thai bilingual program producing much better results, and therefore reducing the likelihood of these young people being alienated and being drawn into conflict. In the course of this work, I came up with some generalizations about the links between language and conflict, and I call them slow acting and fast acting. The slow acting effect is the failure of language policies to produce equal education rights and multilingual achievement for minority children. So the slow acting effect of poor literacy and language education provision, which pushes children into intergenerational disadvantage. And this leads to all sorts of alienation. And as we saw in Professor Premsurat's statement, the possibility of being drawn into conflict. But the fast-acting effect is also there, and that is unfortunately in display in many countries as well, all across the world, which is basically hate speech, forms of verbal abuse, or even in occasions where there's no verbal abuse, but national discourses that exclude any mention or recognition of minority populations. So the message that they receive all the time is that they don't belong, that there's no place for them in the citizenship compact of the society. As you can see from, I'm quoting myself there, some aspect of language is present in many conflicts. Some kinds of conflict involve many aspects of language, but there are also some conflicts that are only about language. So language is present in the loss of social cohesion in many different ways, and it's often present in ways that people don't take account of. And I think it's a great shame if language policy scholars don't consider this a problem, because it is a problem and it needs to be understood and discussed as a problem, because that's how policy officials see these things. So yes, we want to advocate language as a right and as a resource. We don't have a problem-based language policy, we have a problem-solving based language policy. So some of the connections between cohesion and conflict are how language is culturally a symbol of the identity of groups, how economically and pragmatically language policies interact with jobs, training, apprenticeship, mobility, and pay, how it affects political citizenship, belonging, inclusion, being part of the citizenry of a country, and very importantly, literacy and access to the whole curriculum of the school. So I want to just describe now how in the facilitated dialogues we deal with these kinds of questions. And usually what's involved is the 45 or so that we've done in Myanmar, about 30 use this method in a very elaborated way in the last period of my work there. We create a temporary nation of speech and writing, and we agree on how we will speak to each other, how we will agree, disagree, and decide, what is the role of evidence and research, what is my role as a facilitator. I'll describe voice and vote democracy in a minute. And then we collectively write a language policy. And the we are people who are in the following categories: communities and representatives of communities, language and culture associations in Myanmar, language teachers, parents, who of course don't necessarily know the jargon of the experts, the other group of people who are present. And that's part of the reason why we go through this process. And then the third category are officials, public officials, including military officers in quite a few cases where we've done this in Myanmar. And we go through a process of naming, renaming the problem, working at the problem in different ways, seeing whose representation of the problem advantages whom, when education officials say that the problem is that the minority language children don't know the dominant language. We take that statement, we don't attack anyone, we put it up on a board and we work through it to see what does it mean to say that the problem is that minority children don't know the dominant language. Isn't this just a problem of how schools are organized rather than any problem residing in the child? So we work with the problem to deproblematize the problem. We try and make what officials say is impossible, we try and make it possible. And we work through voice democracy and vote democracy because we only have 3 to 4. One of these dialogues of 60 people went on for 5 days. These are full-time days, including evenings and mornings. So we have voice democracy where we try to convince others with rhetoric, facts, and new perspectives. And the advantage of doing this, slowly, gradually writing the same text together, which is authored by everybody, is that we can agree to disagree. But when we reach consensus, we know it's inefficient because it takes us time to work through this. In the long term, it's 100 times better because people are in a stronger, more informed position. Sometimes we reach points where we have to vote. And when we do vote, I call that vote democracy. So I call the first form of democracy voice democracy and vote democracy. Sometimes the first form is called deliberation. And vote democracy is, of course, what we all know. We raise our hands in public or we do secret ballots. And the problem with this, of course, is that someone loses. And we have to find a way that the people who don't win will accept the result. And this depends on a lot of voice democracy to make this happen as well. But it has the advantage of being efficient in the short term, but in the long term, most formal democracies that depend just on voting have a lot of problems because they don't produce the integrated peace and social cohesion that Galtung was referring to, which comes about through voice democracy. I'll just give you some images of how we do this. We write and rewrite and continually rewrite so that we're constantly dealing with the issues together. Now, that's the method of the facilitated dialogue. Some radical things are changing today, however. One of them is that there is an explosion of multilingualism research all around the world. Kathleen Hu described a lot of that wonderfully yesterday. We can see that there's this explosion of terminology, multivocality, plurilingualism, translanguaging, metrolingualism, polylingualism, horizontal and vertical multilingualism, multilinguality, linguistic repertoires, dominant language constellations. And I've contributed to this myself. Now, one of the problems with this, and this is an inevitable way in which academics work, we produce new concepts, we give them new labels, but it actually creates more and more distance between the work of scholarship and the activity of policymaking. Now, this is fine in academic environments, but language policy and planning is not just an academic exercise. It's there to make an impact on the real world. And this explosion of terminology can produce alienation and echo chambers and a gap. Well, there's always a gap between public officials and the community and academics. We're never going to get over that. But sometimes it's too big, and I think it is too big for language policy today. Look, I might skip that. I just want to say that in addition to all of this, of course, we have a great hierarchy. No, I will go back to that. Professor Richard Johnston has talked about what's going on in the world in all countries, global north, global south. A third wave of starting early with second languages, which he calls possibly the world's biggest policy development in education at preschools, schools, kindergartens, early childhood centres. And we see that it's become very popular. Elites are very interested in this. Now, this is Princess Charlotte. She must be the heir to the throne of England. I don't know if they still have, maybe she isn't, maybe it's just the boys. But anyway, when it was announced that she was a bilingual English-Spanish speaking child at age 2, it made front pages of the newspapers in Australia, in England. I saw it in Canada, in the United States. And this is extraordinary when you think about the millions upon millions upon millions of children all around the world who are just as adorable and just as smart as Princess Charlotte. And they are bilingual in multiple languages and often trilingual and more. So we have a big problem of elitism around bilingualism. It's not to take anything away from her. I'm sure it's wonderful that her parents have brought her up in Spanish and English as well. The problem isn't this. The problem is the fact that we celebrate some, but not all kinds of achievement in languages. And we do regard the multilingualism of minority children as a problem, whereas we regard the bilingualism of some children as a source of celebration. So we have this widespread growth of early second language education. We have elites all around the world fascinated by and interested in languages. So if we just take a view of languages, we would be delighted. We would be happy. There's so much interest in it. But that's why MTB-MLE has been coined in the way that was described yesterday. And there are many people from the network participating in this conference. It's mother tongue-based multilingual education, the languages that children have in their homes, which are not celebrated, which are actually hounded out of the school system in many societies, and which erodes social cohesion and produces the kinds of conflicts that I was saying. In a global world like the one we're inhabiting, of mobility, connectivity, and all of these other changes, this is no longer acceptable. One of my colleagues and friends who's one of the great scholars of Australian Aboriginal languages, Indigenous languages, Professor Nicholas Evans, and a great expert in the origin of multilingualism, describes it as the default human condition in terms of current worldwide demography, arguably our primal human state. This is very important to say this because some people imagine that actually multilingualism, as language planning theory in its origins also thought, is a factor that holds back, that we could get rid of it. It holds back social development. But we see, in fact, that it is actually, as Evans describes here, our primal human state. What we are repressing is an essential quality of being human. And in many societies, oppressing is too strong a word, of course, but in other societies, it's not too strong a word at all. So whether it's teachers in schools, nurses in hospitals, whoever it is, we need to negotiate increasingly across linguistic differences everywhere. Look, I'm going to skip this one. So academics, through this kind of work, have produced 3 broad ways of understanding this multilingualism. And I don't think they're very compatible with each other today, but I want to just mention them and then talk about the middle one, because that's the one I've been working in recent years. Translanguaging, which is a very important innovation. It actually comes, the word itself, out of Welsh bilingual education in Wales in the 1960s. And it talks about not segregating languages, because in any case, the learner doesn't segregate languages. If a teacher teaches to students in English and the children are the speakers of an Orang Asli language in central peninsular Malaysia, they might be processing that knowledge that they're hearing from the teacher partly in their mother tongue, partly in English, partly in Malay. So there is always a presence of multiple languages, even in receptive work. The application of translanguaging increasingly, as you can see in the right here, is to activate all of the language assets in informal communication, but also education. Meryl Swain did wonderful work on languaging and translanguaging, and other people have too. So there's a great deal of rich new concepts here, but it doesn't register well in policy-making settings. And I think in language revival situations, I think there are many questions to ask about the limits of favouring the presence of even dominant languages in environments where we're trying to support non-dominant languages. I'll go to the bottom one before coming into the middle. Language repertoire comes out of the work of a very important American scholar, Gumpertz, who looked at the total proficiency and abilities that individuals have. He called it their repertoire, and other people, Barbara Bush and other people, have elaborated this. It includes partial languages and partial proficiencies, the entire range and repertoire, the totality of a person's abilities. So I could include very, very, very basic Malay in my language repertoire, but I wouldn't call myself even remotely a speaker of Bahasa Malaysia. So this is where repertoire is different from the dominant language constellations concept, which comes out of the work of Larissa Aronin. I co-wrote a book with her last year called Dominant Language Constellations, and we talk about the cluster of languages that are dominant in the life, prominent in the life of an individual or a society. Like we could quite readily identify the DLC of Malaysia. We know in Singapore, for example, it would be English, two or three varieties of Chinese, English and Singlish, Tamil, and Hindi, and of course, Malay. So dominant language constellations refers to a cluster of languages, not the entirety of multilingualism. And here, the reason I favor it is because it helps us in talking to policymakers who are actually put off by discourses of multilingualism because these are not able to be dealt with. Now, Patrick Lee, Hamid and Hadi have extended some of this work, and they talk about the Navarin model. They've got Southeast Asia in mind, building on experiences in Philippines, South Africa, and India. This consolidated multilingual provision mode, the national language, the NA, the vernacular language, the VR, and the IN for the international language, usually English, the Navarin model. So this is an effort from these scholars to reimagine a multilingual policy alternative. This is a 2021 publication, alternative for Southeast Asian public policy. And it responds to what I've called myself the extranational, which could be English, but it could be Putonghua, Chinese. So the extranational beyond a particular society, if we were talking about Thailand, for now English or Japanese or Chinese. Subnational languages, the 77 or so languages of Thailand, and then the national level, the varieties of Thai. So this is the Navarin model. So you can see there's a lot of really creative efforts to try to deal with something that can be used in discourse with policymakers. I think that's really important to keep in mind, that that's what I'm favoring here. And here I'm going to give a shout out to my PhD student, Surya Selassie Anggit Asra Ramlan, who did a wonderful PhD at the University of Melbourne in 2020, titled Languages and Learning Amongst Orang Asli Students in Malaysia. And this research, which is based on as it says in the middle there, the Malaysian Aboriginal Peoples Act of 1954 and the education blueprints of Malaysia, which aim to improve the education of students either on Peninsular Malaysia or in Eastern Malaysian states of Sabah and Sarawak, for the success of these children in schooling and for their development in their learning of Malay, English, and we hope also the retention and development of their languages. This wonderful research looks at the attitudes of teachers, parents, and students of these children, and she uses the dominant language constellation concept that we've been talking about. It's represented here. You can see, I can't talk about it very much, obviously for the interest of time, but you can see how richly it predicts the relationship of the languages of these children, who might be Seme, Temia, Semele, Jakun, Temuan, Seletar speakers, plus Malay, plus English in their DLC in the central part. Then on the outer circle with Arabic, Chinese, Indonesian, and Korean, other Orang Asli languages that might surround them. So the DLC concept allows us to speak graphically in this case, but verbally in other ways, a constellation of languages, not the totality of multilingualism, the constellation that is relevant for policy decision in a particular setting. Julia's research paints a clear picture of how these students relate to the world through these languages. And interestingly, so many of them express internalized struggles as a marginalized group, and it makes them eager to redefine their identities, even beyond local and national boundaries. Many of them aim for a cosmopolitan and globalized identity that embraces English as linguistic capital as well. Hence, the importance of keeping all of these levels together. So if you're interested, there's 2 volumes already out. In the one on the right is 2021, and the one on the left is 2020 through Springer. And the one on the right is more focused on education, and the one on the left on theory. This one hasn't printed very well, unfortunately, but this is the DLC of a student, a German teacher in Sri Lanka. I won't talk about it because it's lost the stars. I don't know what's happened there in the. So another part of the context that's going to be relevant, of course, will be starting next year, the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And this is a way for all of us to focus mother tongue-based multilingual education in the context of global 1 decade long focus. Keeping focus for a decade is not going to be easy, but I think it's very important for the organizers of this conference and all of you listening now to think about activities that we can all do that bring to the attention of policymakers. And when I say a policymaker, sometimes people say, but I don't talk to policymakers. But the principal or the headmaster of the school your children go to or where you teach, I think is a policymaker. I think when a school teacher closes the school door, and I know not everyone teaches in a school with a school door, but when the teacher takes over, that teacher is making policy decisions about how languages will be used in the class, which ones we will have which attitudes towards, how we will respond or recognize, privilege the languages that we hear there, etc. That's policy making. It's very important that we don't imagine the policy is something other people do to us. It's something that we can be part of the conversation of as well. And part of the reason why this is important is because schools are going to be radically exposed for their limits in the next 5 years at least. I'm not going to be able to talk about this too much, but I do want to say something about it, because what's happening to literacy in what a colleague of mine here, Professor Leslie Farrell, calls literacy 4.0, is going to radically change how we think about all languages. And I'm going to just mention this in the following way. In the last 24 hours, how many of you have viewed texts, listened to texts that you would have once read? How many of you have written texts that you composed orally rather than verbally? How many of you have used any of these mediating devices, everything from Snapchat, which I don't even know what it is really, but some of these others that, you know, the pen and paper, which is still my level of sophistication, and all of these other things. What's going on in this world of instant communication is about to be completely swept away by robotics and cyber physical systems. I was about to tell a personal story, but I won't about this. But let me just say that it's possible for a surgeon based physically in Chicago in the United States to operate on a patient in Melbourne without physically leaving Chicago. This is the tying of artificial intelligence to the cyber physical, meaning the physical response through robotics of an intelligence message that comes through software somewhere else. This is the fourth industrial revolution. The computer age is already passé, it's already behind us. The fourth industrial revolution is cyber physical AI, and it will radically change what counts as literacy, and it will challenge schooling in the greatest way in the whole history of schooling. We will have to completely rethink everything we do about language maintenance, mother tongue-based multilingual education, multilingual communication in general, our notion of what literacy and proficiency is and are. I think it's important for every group that's concerned with minority communities in particular, small communities, to embrace these. I've worked with the Indigenous Literacy Foundation in Australia. I did a large project for them over the last 18 months. And they are producing remarkable early childhood talking books that allow children, preschool children, to explore the natural environment in which they live in very deeply culturally relevant pedagogies and localized ways, which gives these children the ability to start school without necessarily having had access to formal trained teachers already literate in their mother tongue in a way that wouldn't have been possible even 4 years ago. So I'm not normally a techno person, and I don't believe in utopias of technology, but I don't believe we should dismiss what's going on either. It's very relevant, especially for remote and marginalized populations. And a way to think about this is to think of all children, even if they were monolingual, as having at least 100 languages, inspired by the work of early childhood educators who've always been more sensitive and more aware of expressive richness in life than almost any other education system, and educators and their perception and closeness to the meaning making that children develop through their languages, all of their languages, the languages of expression and the languages of their lives, their mother tongues and dominant languages that they must deal with when they move through the institutions of society that we force them to go through. This might sound like a very obvious thing to say, but I do want to just briefly mention that we need to keep in mind that we force children to go to school. There are laws in all of the societies that anyone listening comes from, which take children's liberty away from them and force parents to send them to school. This means we have a moral, ethical responsibility to make sure that what they experience in school is the richest and most life-affirming it can possibly be. So, I've said that already. If you're interested in the work that I was talking about in relation to these facilitated dialogues, where we grab problems as named by other people and we turn them into a source of debate and discussion and reconstitute them in a rich and powerful way, you can find that these reported in the Malaysian case study in the middle, which you can get online easily enough, but also in other work that's available. Here are some of the references that I've used. Not all of them I've actually quoted because I took some slides out. Thank you very much for your attention. I don't know how long I've gone, or I assume there's still time for questions. So I'll stop talking now and answer questions. Over to you, Dr. Joseph Lee.
Thank you so much, Professor Lo Bianco. Your timing is just perfect. So we still have about 20 minutes for question and answer. And once again, thank you for the sharing on your insight about the importance of the language policy and also the implication of maybe lacking of a language policy. And also you make quite a number of substantial observations on the process of policy formation and different models of the multi-language policy as well. I think personally, I gain a lot, and I do believe that our participants also have a lot of questions want to share with you. So ladies and gentlemen, that if you have a questions, you can actually type into the chat box, so we can actually get the views from Professor Lo Bianco on the questions. Since we're waiting for the question to come in, and one of the advantages of being a moderator is that probably I can ask the first question, if you don't mind, Professor Lo Bianco. And I'm very interested in your comments about your experiences in Myanmar, where you mentioned that you engage a number of different interest groups, like parents, teachers, and even the military official. And and you have been working with different countries as well. Do you see that kind of formation or the different grouping of interest group more or less the same? I think the bottom line question is that in different countries, who is actually taking the driving seat for formation of language policy? I think I don't know whether it makes sense to you or not, but that is probably one of the questions I hope that get some insight from you.
Do you mean now? Who is?
Yeah, if you can. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, well, in 2014 and 2015, the National Education Law was adopted. It was modified in 2015, and it transfers the right to decision-making, not completely, about language to states. And so some states have been innovating in the provision of mother tongue-based multilingual education. But of course, that's all been totally disrupted. And currently, the National Unity Government, which is the remnants of the Kluto, the National Parliament, who have not been detained by the military, who have left the country and are organized online mostly, and other people, have written very extensive language policies. And for the first time that, I've been helping them with this, I've done some seminars, and we have a working group which has written this work. There's very extensive policies that favor, for the first time, very strong mother tongue-based approach. So we can only hope that democracy will return to Myanmar and the new government will be able to end the terrible things that are going on there and begin a new process of granting rights to minority populations. I think the prospects of that happening are probably better than many people realize. I don't want to go into a political discussion about it, but there are, the government is not, the coup has not been successful like the military thought it would be. So there is a very active NUG education effort, and the minister is, and the deputy minister are both deeply committed to MTB Emily.
Thank you so much for that feedback. And there are quite a number of questions we have received. One of the questions mentioned, asking what is your opinion, for example, in Malaysia, that majority ethnic not consider mother tongue-based multi-language education a way for social coherence, but rather to consider that as enforcing official language or single language education as a national unity tools. What would be your opinion on that?
Yes, I feel like in my report I wrote this, and in fact we had a submission that went to the National Unity committee in the Prime Minister's office, and it was, I believe they took it to the cabinet as well. I got a copy of what looked like a cabinet document discussing this. We asked them to move away from this stress and to have a more open-ended approach of language rights. I believe that Malaysia has a lot to teach the world. I think that the level of possibility in Malaysia is very high, but I think some key steps need to be done that go further for minority groups. I think this is really the case. Of course, children in Malaysia will have to do at least 2 languages other than their mother tongue if they're not speakers of Bahasa Melayu or Malaysia or English, because this will mean Chinese or Tamil or an indigenous language or another language still. But we know that this is possible. We know that this can happen. Malaysia has good resources, very good teacher education. My last visit to Malaysia was to Penang, and I spent a lot of time working with people on the English curriculum and cultural perspectives, multicultural perspectives in it. And the research that was being cited was almost all of it written in Malaysia. So you have a really strong position compared to other societies where I think they can't draw on local research as easily. And that's because there's been investment in this in Malaysia. However, I think the policy positions really are in need of reform right now, to be much more open, and they really need to be more multilingual. And I do believe that the experiments that were started on the mathematics and science in English that were abandoned a few years ago, that were quite controversial, I followed that quite closely, and I was very disappointed that that was imposed on teachers so quickly. And of course, they had no time. They'd been teaching chemistry or science in Malay, and suddenly from next Monday, they have to do it in English. This is very bad policy making, which is the way they do it in Australia, unfortunately. It's very important that we do language policy making in a more careful, considered and systematic way. And this involves talking to the communities in the way that Surya Angit's research, Dr. Angit's research shows, dealing with students and communities. We can build alternatives at a local level. So a little bit more decentralization, a little bit more openness. I think that the whole country would benefit from that.
Thank you so much for that. There are quite a number of other questions, but I think I pick up one question from the chat box, and I think this is very much relevant to the earlier question. The question asks, how seriously are these reports from this dialogue taken up by policymakers and implemented first by legislations, then in actuality? I guess the question is not only for Malaysia, but for other Southeast Asian countries as well.
Well, it depends on the level of participation of the officials in the dialogues. If the officials don't attend, or if they attend and they feel like they're attacked, or if they attend and they feel like the language is too academic and alienating or not practical, then we lose them. But we have many successful cases, very many. And in fact, the people who run the MLE network in Bangkok have held policy forums at which, I ran one myself, which officials attended, and the Bangkok statement on mother tongue-based multilingual education is one of the examples of this. A lot of the officials, when they're included in discussions that acknowledge that they have practical problems to deliver. Unfortunately, a lot of academic work is critical and not productive and not constructive. And that's really, criticism is important in academic life, of course, but if we're going to influence policy, we have to understand where policymakers are coming from and meet them halfway. And in the dialogues in Myanmar, we helped shape the 2015 law. Some of the clauses came out of the dialogues that we did. In three of the states, we wrote state laws that were adopted by the state parliaments in Kachin State, Kayin State, and Mon State, and they began implementing programs. Some research studies have already been done on this. There's, it doesn't always achieve success, but people always learn something by participating in this, and they develop their own advocacy skills. So we found that parents, in one of the dialogues that we did, when we returned 6 months later, had already been to see school district chiefs advocating, writing statements which they had learned to do in the dialogue. So a lot of skills are gained in this process, skills of advocacy, representation, putting together a little bit of a research project, which gives people a voice in discussions with policy officials. But sometimes they achieve a great deal. They can achieve a great deal if the policy officials and the other categories of people in those sessions work together. In Sri Lanka, we also had quite a lot of success, and that's how we produced the policy in Australia. So it's not going to happen in all cases, but in many cases, what's required is repeat efforts. The first, you can't do it in 4 or 5 days. The first time you deal with language problems, people are building their understanding of how policy works and how policy officials think, and people learn to talk to each other. The second time you go, you can move much further towards crafting statements together, etc. So it's a process of development.
Once again, thank you. I think this is another related question, but you may have addressed that partially just now. The question asks, any solution toward the academics which without talking to policymaker or politics, will as the important factor to push mother tongue-based multi-language education for the purpose of social coherence. So I think it's very much about the recommendation of yours in terms of how academics should engage with the policymaker.
I think academics should not wait until their research studies are finished before they engage, because there might be special reasons why they can't do this. I accept this, but in some cases, it's a good idea to start talking to the people who, in general terms, who might be your target early in a research study, because that way that helps you take their perspective into account. It's very important to have regular discussions with them if you can have access to them. It's not always possible in all societies. It's important also to produce plain language versions of the findings of the study, because we know studies are written in academic language. That's not always going to be comprehensible to policymakers. I've heard academics say, oh, policy officials don't read our research. Well, policy officials are busy people. They're running departments, they're responsible for budgets, they have lots of pressures on their time. And most of what they do is responding to the minister who's demanding this. And ministers, I've worked for 4 or 5 ministers, and they always want this yesterday. So an academic is not going to get anywhere by expecting that a policy official is going to read their research. Now, not all research is for policy, of course. So, I'm not saying we should only write for them. But if we want to influence policy, we can't expect that the policymaker will come to us. We have to make the effort to produce digestible material. We have to interact with policymakers. We should invite them to activity. We should educate journalists. We should bring them into, I've worked a little bit with the MLE group in Bangkok, and we've discussed many of these things. and done them, and we've done them for many, many years here and in other places, to build up relationships with the media so that we educate them so they don't put stereotyped versions of what we're asking for. And we should do the same with the officials to build their knowledge of our work as we build our knowledge of theirs. We do speak different languages. Policy officials are in a different mental universe from academic researchers. We have to see it as a cultural negotiation between us and them.
Okay, we still have 5 more minutes for this session, and I think if we may pick up one more question from the chat box. It mentioned that mother tongue-based multi-language education aims to create social coherence and harmony in the society. However, the attraction toward the international language, that is English, seems to create diversion or division in the society. How would it be minimized and resolved? I think it's the conflict between the mother tongue language and international language. What will be your view on that?
Yes. This is why I gave the examples of Navarin and the comprehensive policy approach and understanding what the problems are, because students will not achieve good levels in English if we erode their language abilities in their mother tongue. They will also probably become more alienated from their community and their traditions, and this will store up problems for the long term. So I think we have to build in an understanding that pushing international languages too early and too fast can be a cause of conflict. So the solution to this is comprehensive language policy. That's why I use that word comprehensive, where in the same policy, in the same text, this is what I recommended to the Malaysian government from that report that we did. And I know a submission went to cabinet, obviously it didn't get through, but we, in the same policy, to deal with all of those issues together, just like the multilingualism comes together in the life of an individual, so too should the policies deal with all of these things. Because if you produce a mother tongue based policy and then you produce a policy just for Bahasa Malaysia, the national official language, and then you produce a policy just for English, it's very likely, given the social hierarchy involved, that the policy for English, which is going to be justified with the promise of jobs and travel and employment, is going to get much more media attention. It's going to be more valued by some groups, and this will squeeze out the place for the other language. But we should bring them together. We need to bring them together so that we're not seen to be against the learning of languages of trade and commerce and cosmopolitanism, because if we have that reputation, then policy officials won't talk to us. We have to have the reputation of doing all the comprehensive work that's needed. And the problem is that policy officials don't have the concepts that academics have, and academics don't have the constraints and understandings that the policy officials have. So there is an intercultural conversation that's not working very well. And in the dialogues, we bridge these.
Thank you for the feedback. And I was given a few more minutes by the organizing committee, since there are many interesting questions here. I think all of the participants are very interested in your insight on the policy formation. And so if I may ask one more question on behalf, and which was raised in the chat box, and then probably Professor Lo Bianco, you can actually conclude. The question says that the democratic approach might be acceptable in a country practicing democracy. But however, that what could academics and educators do if that is not the case in the country where democracy is really not in practice?
Yes, this is of course the case, and it's a very big constraint. I've worked in many societies where exactly these conditions happen, but there are still forms of discussion that are available to academics families and policy officials or governments that are surprisingly more open than people realize. I don't believe it, unless it's an incredibly authoritarian situation where no discussion is allowed whatsoever, and obviously there's not much that can be done there. Unless it's a situation like that, I think there's scope in nearly every context for something. And if there isn't, then I think local action is what's needed. If you look at social movements, I'm just about to finish a chapter for a book on the MLE movement, and I've been looking at, in Southeast Asia, and I've been looking at movements in general in Southeast Asia as part of the frame for this. I've been held up by some illness, but I'm basically going to look at spaces that are available when it looks like there are no spaces available. And it's surprising how often that is the case. In quite authoritarian settings, there is often the possibility of local action. And then how things are framed can allow for wider kinds of discussions. So in policy making, we have to be realistic. Realism and realistic attitudes are essential. That's why I think the academic approach of endless criticism really has a limit when it comes to policy. We have to be practical, pragmatic, useful. We have to not abandon our principles, never abandon principles, but always interact with and take on board the perspectives of other groups.
Thank you. That's definitely very useful recommendation and insight for academics and educators. We can all work together on this. I think we are running out of the time, and while there are many interesting questions, I will try to relate to Professor Lo Bianco so we can actually share the question or any insight later on as well. Before we close the session, Professor Lo Bianco, do you want to have some concluding remarks?
Thank you very much for your attention. I think I might have given a slightly incorrect impression about the Soweto situation in South Africa. I'm sorry if I did that. The protest was against the Bantu Act, so it really was, that was my main point, that I was a Bantu Education Act. But the most important thing I want to leave you with, everybody, is the optimism that it's possible to persuade people and to ask academic researchers to interact more with. I'm a great believer in dialogue, and not just in dialogue, but in the culture of dialogue. I think we can learn the culture of dialogue, and we can teach ourselves the culture of dialogue. And when you work with people who disagree with you, as I've done much in my time, you realize that unfortunately in universities, often we are with people who actually agree with us. When we move outside of that environment, we grow a great deal, I think, in our sophistication of knowledge of things. And language policy and planning, if we use concepts like social cohesion, we've got enormous evidence to advance the case of the rights of speakers of minority languages, especially in the most multilingual part of the world, Southeast Asia and Melanesia. So what we've got, I think, is an ethical responsibility as academics to engage with this much more in a collegial and scholarly way. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Professor Lo Bianco, and thank you for the wonderful insight sharing. And we learned a lot. And I think many participants today, they still have questions and they still want to engage with you. And I think we will try to find other opportunity so we can hear from you as well. And once again, thank you so much, Professor Lo Bianco, for your sharing. And then I think we will end the session this morning, and I will return the floor to Ms. Cho.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you so much. And thank you to Dr. Lo Bianco for the inspiring and thought-provoking sharing. I am extremely grateful when Dr. Lo Bianco explained the language oppression and the relationship between language, conflict, and cohesion. It is important to recognize the struggle, especially for the Orang Asli community, while we are talking about nation building, cohesion, democracy of diversity. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Lee, for moderating a session. We enjoyed the session very much. And well, this is the end of keynote session, and I'm thankful to Dr. Lo Bianco, Dr. Lee, and the audience for your active participation in the discussion. So for information, the Secretariat will upload the slideshow to our website upon approval from the presenters, and you're welcome to view the PowerPoint at our official website, which the link can be found in the chat box. So we'll have a break about less than 30 minutes, and please be back in your seats at 11 a.m. We will come back with the second panel session on mother tongue-based multilingual education experience in Southeast Asia countries. Thank you and see you later.